Kansas in general. So without further ado, take it away.
I'll try not to trip myself, but I can't stand still when I talk. So. Before coming to Kansas, I worked in Idaho for the NRCS up there. And I was a soil conservationist. And we lived just outside of Boise in an area known as the Treasure Valley. And while working for the NRCS up there, I dealt mostly with irrigation-induced erosion because we didn't have a lot of rainfall. Rainfall up there was only 10 inches for the year, and in the time I was there, we only ever averaged 7 to 8 inches, and the wind never blew. So it was never hard to figure out when to plan a picnic in the summer, because you always pretty much knew what the weather was going to be. It was going to be hot and sunny. Well, I was trained mostly to identify and work with irrigation-induced erosion, and lots of it, because all the cropland and all the pasture land was all irrigated, and 75% of it was still flood irrigated. So most of our fields were land leveled, and the average field size up there was only about 20 acres. So small fields, and a lot of them would have sediment basins at the end of their field because they had erosion rates that exceeded 10 to 20 tons to the acre. So I got to see a lot of soil displaced because within the first couple irrigations, they would have to clean out those sediment basins and put it all the way back on the top end of the field. And again and again and again. And if they didn't, it went straight to the Boise River. So when I first got to my new home in Kansas, I looked around and not seeing a lot of irrigation. And when you looked on paper in the file cabinet, everything is computed on the average. The average year, the average rainfall event, the average wind event, the average soil, the average farm. And all those averages said that erosion rates were less than 2 tons to the acre. Well, what seemed to be the problem here, because that's not necessarily what I was seeing. And then I got to witness my first windstorm. That was when we were here on Memorial Day for Shoes, Cruise, and Barbecue. I'm sure you guys remember the day, blew the top off the church over there. Well, after being out in the barbecue all day, I was home reading the worst hard time about the dust storm when the wind ripped open the storm door on the kitchen and yanked the door clear out of the frame, and the whole kitchen filled with soil. And it wasn't soil at that point because it was definitely out of place in my kitchen, let me tell you. And when I couldn't see across the kitchen floor, I'm thinking, I don't think that the Dust Bowl is completely over because I'm pretty sure it's happening in my kitchen right now. And a few months later, when we had a large rainfall, 6, 8 inches in an evening, I got to see what terraces look like when they're washed out from a sudden deluge of water. And I thought to myself, I'm beginning to see the problem here. Things don't happen here on the average. Average day, average event, average soil. No, everything here is really dramatic. You have a sudden deluge of water after you've had months of drought. And when you have wind, it doesn't just blow. No, it blows you away. So everything is wild and dramatic. I got kind of a kick out of my kids because like I said, it didn't rain a lot in Idaho, where we were at. And when it did, it had these just real soft, gentle rains. It could rain for 12 hours long, and at the end of it, we'd be really excited when we got 1/4 inch. In the entire time I was there, I cannot tell you a single storm event where we ever got more than 1/2 inch, ever. It just didn't fall that quickly. So the first spring here, we had mud runs, and so I was taking the kids to school and being on the gravel roads. We were slashing back and forth, and the cars fishtailing, and the Coulter and Laredo's eyes got about yay big. And Coulter says, "Does it rain like this all the time?" And Laredo says, "Are we gonna die?" No and yes, but hopefully not today. So it occurs to me that the land here needs to be prepared, both in the event of an emergency, which seems to be all the time with the weather, or prepared to take advantage of a sudden deluge of water. So the question you ought to be asking yourself is, how do I prepare my land to be ready in the event of an emergency? And is my land covered in order to take advantage of an opportunity? Well, that first summer, I had a wonderful opportunity to go on a bus tour with the No-Till on the Plains. And we went up to North Dakota, and I got to meet a farmer up there by the name of Gove, and I drank the punch while I was up there. Inside joke. But the farmer up there related to me a story of a 10-inch rainfall that he had received in a single evening. And at the end of it, he had no erosion, no runoff, and it all soaked into his ground. That was pretty impressive. And I thought, well, maybe they got a different soil type. Yeah, it is a little sandier. But his neighbor had erosion, his neighbor had runoff, and his neighbor still had standing water in his fields. So what made the difference? Well, I also met another researcher on that same bus tour, a researcher by the name of Dwayne Beck out of South Dakota. And on his farm, he had large sprinkler systems, which, being from Idaho, I was used to dealing with a lot of the issues that are associated with that, such as when you have a unit moving across the land with the tires, you tend to get ruts underneath the tires that are moving across. And that was something I was used to dealing with. We came up with all kinds of ways, offset booms and straw bales in the ruts and pan bags hanging off of it and all kinds of crazy stuff. But Dwayne didn't have any of those things. So what was it that these two men had in common? And was it possible for us to have that type of infiltration rate here in Kansas? Well, it seems to me that part of the answer lies in the residue that they had on their surface. And that this residue can lead to increased infiltration, improved soil health, and because of these factors, a resiliency to drought. Because the way that the residue is working starts to become a self-perpetuating spiral. The more residue you have, the more organic matter that you have. Therefore, you have increased infiltration. So your following crop can do better, and therefore put more residue on, and increase the organic matter. So it becomes an upward spiral. But by the same token, as our forefathers in the 30s discovered, it can also become a downward spiral. One failed crop means less residue means more wind erosion, loss of your topsoil, and now you have another failed crop and less residue, and pretty soon you're going down a downward spiral and you have no way to get out. So that leads us to increasing the residue on the field. And how do we go about this? But more importantly, why does it even work? Well, there are 4 ways that residue helps us become more resilient to drought. The first way is it's just simply a covering on the soil. They refer to it as a soil armor, and it protects the soil surface. So I've got a demonstration here, and I have 2 willing assistants, if you guys would come up here, please, to help me work on this demonstration. Okay, I'll tell you to put the first tension. Then we'll need to put the first tension. Not yet. This is what's known as a rainfall simulator. Some of you may have seen this at larger functions, and there's a very large rainfall simulator display. But in our context of our event tonight, there was 2 problems with that. Number 1, it's really messy, and I don't think Marvin would like me making a mud pies up here on his floor. And the second thing is it works off of a sprinkler nozzle, and so it takes a while to apply the water. So we have kind of the short down version here, the miniature tabletop version, and I think you guys will get the idea. Okay, what I did to gather these soils is these metal trays right here are open on the bottom, much like this ring would be. Matter of fact, geometrically speaking, they're identical in size. So I took those metal trays out into the soil and pounded them in, which I was lucky, found a warm day that I was able to do that, and dug them up. So they are open on the bottom. So now, as water is applied in our rainfall event, it has 2 choices. It can either soak into the soil profile, and it's got an opening here. It would show up down below in our profile container, or it will simply run off. And in reality, that's the only 2 choices that a raindrop ever has when it hits the ground, is it's either going to soak in or run off. So, the kids each have a bottle of water that has 440 milliliters in it, which is the exact amount of an inch of rain in that size container. So, will you guys go ahead and pour your first inch in? Now, you have to realize that when a raindrop hits the soil surface, it's like a miniature nuclear explosion. When it first hits, the soil is bounced up by the effect of the raindrop. And we're leaking. There we go. Once those soil particles are dislodged, they become very easy to transport or to move. Now, one thing when you're moving soil particles, the velocity, the speed of the water has a lot to do with how much soil is going to be removed. So I brought this as a demonstration. In this gallon of water, I dissolved 1 tablespoon of soil. Let's say that this stream here in my gallon jar was moving at 5 miles per hour. If the speed of that was doubled to 10 miles per hour, you would think that the soil that it could carry would be doubled at 2 tablespoons. But actually, it's at 2 to the 6th power, or 64 times the amount of soil can be carried when the water speed increases. So at 10 miles per hour, you could have 4 cups of soil being dislodged. And at 20 miles per hour, you suddenly have a 5-gallon bucket moving down the stream system. Kind of explains why when you have a rushing river, it has the capability of taking out an entire stream side, or floating away trees, or cars going down the river. It has to do with the velocity of the water on how much it can move. So just by the simple fact that the residue is slowing down that water, it's reducing the velocity, the speed of that water, and how much soil can be transported off the field. So that was our first inch, and you can see already we're getting some soil movement here. Guys, go ahead and you use this one. Okay, great. Go ahead. The other thing to remember is when the soil, or when the rain is hitting the soil, it is actually hitting at a speed of 20 miles per hour. Now you can tell me that my clouds are probably not as high as the real clouds, so maybe it's not 20 miles per hour here, but then that's an awful fast rainstorm, so I'm probably even. Now that we've gotten it a little wet, you can start to see the effect of our erosion. Look at how clear the water is coming off of this one. These are identical soils, folks. They came from the same field. It happened to be a no-till field that was in growing wheat because, well, quite frankly, that was the only one I could get soil out of that wasn't frozen. But there's a huge difference between the amount of erosion that's coming off of this bare field as compared to the one with residue. But there's one thing you probably can't see out there. Laredo, can you tell me what's in that bottom?
Water.
Water. Is there any in this one?
No.
That's because our residue-filled container has better infiltration, and we're getting that water soaking into the soil profile, and it's coming down there in our box. We're going to have a flood, so I'm going to pour it in these containers for our 3rd inch, but already you can see this one ran off a lot more water than the residue because this was able to soak it in. Hold on. You guys got those next ones filled? Hold on. Ew, yeah.
Looks like dirt actually.
Dirt, right?
Yeah, the dirt actually went off it. I was gonna do that.
There you go. Why don't you go ahead and pour our 3rd inch in? The other thing that a raindrop does when it hits the soil surface is it causes compaction of that soil surface and it seals up the top layer. I think most of you guys have seen this in the field where you have that crusting layer and now you no longer can get infiltration, you can't get the water into the soil profile. It's actually from the action of the raindrop itself causes that action when it dislodges the soil particles and then they form a flat layer. Just having the residue on the surface prevents that and softens that blow and you reduce the compaction and the sealing issues. I know, I'm making a mess. I'm good. They know who's I'm gonna make them clean it up, that's why.
It looks like chocolate.
I just wanted to compare the two. Because if we have 400 milliliters in each inch to have 1,200, we only soaked in 200 milliliters. Where this one, we're already down to 700. So 500 milliliters soaked into our soil profile. Go ahead. What was that? She was trying to show you how much water was coming through to the bottom into our artificial profile. Thank you guys. You guys can sit down. Well, hopefully while you were watching this, you were starting to wonder how much water was actually getting into your soil profile during a rainfall event. And you'd like to think that a 2 to 3 inch rain, you would actually get some good penetration into the soil profile. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. I've taken these rains out to quite a number of fields, and what I've found is it makes a large difference, the health of the soil, how good the infiltration is. And there's an extremely wide variability depending on the time of day or the time of year, how much moisture there is in the soil already, and the condition of it. Anywhere from 1 minute to 45 minutes. And if you're dealing with a true rainfall event, that's a pretty big difference. One of the things that a lot of people think is that, okay, I need to have better infiltration, I better go out there and till the soil and fluff it up. Well, if you were at last year's, we could have explained in detail about how the soil aggregate breaks apart. But what I'm going to tell you is that tillage does not work. It may work initially or appear to for the first raindrop, but quite quickly it seals over and you reduce the amount of infiltration that you get in later rainfalls. What does work is having that residue on the surface of the soil. Because when I do this in a comparison, and I've got one ring on one spot in the field, and then I go over a little ways and I put another ring underneath some residue that was laying there, guarantee it will always have better infiltration underneath that residue. And that seems to be the key to increasing that. The second way that residue can help us be more resilient to drought is that it simply stops the evaporation off of the bare soil. But it takes a lot of residue to be able to do that. There was a K-State study that showed at 100% ground coverage with the residue, you could reduce the evaporation of that field by 50 to 60%. That's equivalent to a savings of 5 inches of moisture. Now, I'm pretty sure that there's been quite a few years where saving 5 inches of moisture would have made the difference between a failed crop and one that you got to harvest. But like I said, it takes a lot, because between 0 and 75% coverage, there was no difference. So 74% ground coverage is the same as 0. It wasn't until 75% and more did you start to see a savings in evaporation. That's how critical having the entire ground is. The third way that residue can help you be more resilient to drought is the shading effect. Everybody likes to be in under the shade. And at a shading effect, you guys may remember this chart from last year, but at 70 degrees soil temperature, 100% of the moisture in that soil goes to grow the crop. But 30 degrees higher, at 100 degrees, only 15% of it goes to growing the crop, and 85% is lost to evaporation and transpiration of the plant, which is basically the plant sweating and trying to cool itself. And by the time you reach 130 degrees, none of it goes to growing the plant. It's all wasted. So just keeping the soil cool goes a long way. Now, the fourth way that residue can help you be more resilient to drought is by far the most complex. But yet, it starts with a very basic principle in that increased residue increases organic matter. And organic matter has a high water holding capacity. So 1 pound of organic matter can hold 18 to 20 gallons of water. Put a different way, a 1% increase in organic matter can improve your water holding capacity nearly 2 inches for every foot of soil. That's a pretty large increase. Now, while it's doing this, as the plant is decomposing and making organic matter, it's bringing carbon dioxide from the air. Let's see, do I have any 6th graders? Oh, just Coulter. Coulter, do you remember the game we played when I came to class? And I had the lifesavers and the pennies. Oh, Loretta remembers too. Do you remember what the lifesavers represented? What is it, Loretta?
Carbon.
Carbon, that's right. I played a game with the kids, and this is what it was explaining, is that the carbon dioxide atoms in the atmosphere are brought by the plant into the plant tissue. And then as the plant dies, those carbon molecules become part of the soil and they feed the soil. Now, that's where it gets really complex, and I could be up here for hours, and you don't want to listen to me. But the important part of that to understand is those carbon is the limiting factor for the soil. It's the building block of the soil itself. And what that is doing is it's feeding the biology. And that biology, including the mycorrhizal fungi, are giving the plant extended roots. That fungi can extend the roots up to 200%, so it can draw in more nutrients and more water. That's a pretty brief description of a very complex system. But hopefully, I've convinced you that residue is indeed important, and hopefully, by now you're asking yourself, how do I increase residue on my surface? Well, it's only going to get there in two ways. You're either going to apply it, or you're going to have to grow it there. Now, applying it can work, but when you're dealing with fields the size of that what we're doing, applying manure or other organic matter is maybe not the most practical because of the sheer size of what we've got. So you're pretty much going to have to grow it. And you're either going to grow it with your cash crop, which would be a high residue crop, or if that's not enough, then you can grow cover crops to get that additional residue. Now, your cash crops, if you have a high residue like wheat, the trick to that is keeping it there. One thing I've learned in Kansas is that it's really windy here, and if it's not tied down, it's going to blow away. So if you cut your wheat stubble and the wind blows, it doesn't stay where you wanted it to, which is on the soil surface. So that's where the cover crops become very useful, is that they're rooted down, and not only their own organic matter, but the other residue from the crops, they can help tie that down. But once you get it there, the important part is to leave it there, not bailing it off, not taking it off in other ways, and not tilling it under, because you don't want it under the soil surface. You want it on top, or you lose most of these benefits that I was talking about. But I did come across a really interesting study. It was out of eastern Kansas, not Kansas, back east somewhere, I can't remember what state. But the important part was, they were studying organic matter. They had a field that they had applied manure on, and one that they hadn't. So predictably, the manure field had a much higher organic matter. But this is where it gets interesting. They continued to study that field with no more additions of manure to see how long they could track that higher level of organic material. 100 years later, they still could detect higher organic matter levels in the manure field over the fields that hadn't received any. And I know I took a step back and went, whoa, what are we doing that will be perceived 100 years from now? What did our forefathers do that we're still having to deal with now, the consequences of what they did? They say during the Dust Bowl of the 30s that some fields in the Dust Bowl region lost anywhere between 4 to 6 inches of topsoil during that decade. It takes 300 to 1,000 years to build an inch of soil. So in a single decade, we lost 6,000 years of soil building. What are we leaving our grandchildren? Do you remember the friend farmer that I was talking about, Gabe Brown? Well, we asked him some advice for Kansas farmers, and this is his reply.
Producers down there. Residue. You got to keep that soil covered. You have to have armor on the soil surface.
Thank you, everyone.